I am Elena, and I am 34 years old. Exactly 12 years ago, on the coldest, most unforgiving night London had seen in a decade, my father threw me out of our family estate in Kensington. I stood on the sidewalk as a blizzard began to bury the city, clutching a single suitcase with a broken zipper and exactly $62 in my pocket. I had done nothing wrong. I had committed no crime. My only sin was daring to ask for the same thing my brother Julian received as a birthright, my tuition for design school. From that frozen night onward, my father built a carefully crafted narrative. He told our relatives, his business partners, and anyone in the London elite who would listen that I was mentally unstable. He claimed I was a danger to myself, that I had a condition I refused to treat, and that my departure was a tragic breakdown rather than an eviction. For 12 years, I lived in the shadow of that lie, building a career from the scraps of my pride while he played the role of the suffering, noble parent. But tonight, the lights are different. Tonight, I am standing on the stage of the Royal Albert Hall, the spotlight of the Golden Needle Awards burning white hot against my crimson gown. This is the most prestigious honor in the global fashion industry, and it is being broadcast live to millions of people. As the presenter prepares to hand me the trophy, I can see the camera lens, and I know that somewhere in a dark study in London, my father is watching. He is surrounded by the very people he has lied to for a decade. He thinks this is his moment of reflected glory, but he has no idea what I am about to say. Before I reveal the words that shattered 12 years of silence, if this story of standing your ground resonates with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I only want you to join us if you truly want to see how justice unfolds. Also, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Where are you watching this from right now, and what time is it in your part of the world? I am always fascinated to see how far these stories travel and which corners of the globe are listening tonight. Let me take you back to the night the world turned to ice. The wind was howling through the streets of Kensington, a sound like a wounded animal. I stood on the front porch of the mansion, my breath hitching in the freezing air. At my feet was my grandmother's old nylon bag, bulging at the seams because I had stuffed my life into it in less than 10 minutes. Through the heavy oak doors and the polished, beveled glass, I could see the grand foyer. I could see the $15,000 chandelier, the one my mother had imported from Murano for their anniversary. It was glowing with a warm, amber light that felt like a mockery. Then I heard the sound that still echoes in my nightmares, the heavy metallic thud of the deadbolt clicking into place. Only 2 hours earlier, I had been sitting at a table covered in white linen at a Michelin-starred French restaurant in Mayfair. We were 30 people deep, celebrating my father's appointment as the head of a major international legal firm. The air smelled of expensive truffles, vintage Bordeaux, and the suffocating arrogance of men who have never been told no. My father had ordered bottles of wine that cost more than my annual rent for the tiny studio I was secretly scouting. I was 22, in my final year of university, and I had just received a thick envelope from the most prestigious fashion academy in Paris. It was my dream. It was a chance to finally be seen as something other than an ornament. The tuition was $58,000 a year. I had rehearsed my request for weeks, choosing this public setting because I thought my father would be too concerned with his image to cause a scene. I thought the presence of his peers would make him more reasonable, more paternal. I was incredibly naive. I waited until the dessert course, when the mood was buoyant and the laughter was loud. I leaned in and whispered, "Dad, could we speak for a moment? Just us?" He didn't even look at me. He adjusted his cufflinks, the gold catching the light of the candles, and spoke loud enough for the entire table to fall silent. "Whatever you have to say, Elena, say it here. We are among friends. There are no secrets in this family." I felt the blood drain from my face, but I pushed forward. I told him about the acceptance letter. I told him about my portfolio and how hard I had worked. I asked if he would consider supporting me the way he was supporting Julian, who sat 3 chairs away, daydreaming about the new Porsche my father had bought him for graduating with a barely passing GPA. My father's expression didn't just harden, it became predatory. He set his wine glass down with a precise, terrifying click. "Help you?" he repeated, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "The way I helped Julian?" He began to laugh, a dry, hollow sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. He stood up then, forcing everyone else to look up at him. My mother, draped in a silk scarf that cost more than my car, didn't look at me. She stared at her plate as if she were trying to count the grains of sugar on her tart. "Elena," my father said, his voice booming with a false sense of authority, "you seem to have forgotten who you are. Julian is a Vance. He is going to lead this firm. He is going to carry our name into the next generation of law. And you are a girl with a hobby. You want me to spend $58,000 a year so you can play with fabric and needles?" He gestured to me with a dismissive wave of his hand, as if I were a waiter who had brought the wrong order. "You will get married. You will take someone else's name. You will raise someone else's children. Why would I invest a single penny in a career that will end the moment you walk down an aisle? Go earn it yourself if you're so talented. Julian doesn't have to ask, because Julian is the future. You are just a guest in this family until someone else takes you off my hands." The silence that followed was deafening. 32 people, my aunts, my uncles, my father's colleagues, all stared at me. No one spoke. No one defended me. I looked at Julian, who just smirked and went back to his phone. I looked at my mother, praying for a sign, a word, anything. She just smoothed her napkin over her lap and whispered to the person next to her about the quality of the wine. That was the moment the bridge burned. 3 days later, I was in a rented room in a crumbling building in East London, eating instant noodles while the heating rattled and failed. That was when the email arrived. It was from my father's personal account. I still remember every sentence, every cruel curve of the font. It said, "Elena, being born female is a reality you refuse to accept. You have no right to demand the resources that belong to your brother. Do not contact me again until you are ready to apologize for the embarrassment you caused me at dinner." I didn't apologize. I didn't cry after the first hour. Instead, I opened a new folder on my laptop. I titled it Evidence. I saved that email, along with the text messages from my cousins, who suddenly started asking me if I was feeling okay or if I needed the name of a good therapist. I didn't know then that my father was already telling the world I had lost my mind. I only knew that I was alone, and that for the first time in my life, I was free to become the woman he was so afraid I would be. As I stand here now in the Royal Albert Hall, the weight of the Golden Needle trophy in my hand feels like the culmination of every cold night and every double shift. The announcer is stepping back, the microphone is mine, and the world is waiting. My father thinks I'm a broken girl. Tonight, he learns that I am the storm. The memory of that restaurant, a gilded palace in Mayfair called L'Etoile, still tastes like ash and bitter wine in my mouth. It was exactly 2 hours before I found myself standing in the freezing London rain, and at the time, I still harbored the foolish, desperate hope that my father might finally see me. I remember the way the crystal chandeliers threw sharp, jagged patterns of light across the white linen tablecloths. The air was heavy, with the scent of expensive truffles and the suffocating arrogance of men who had never known the meaning of the word no. There were 30 guests seated around that long, imperial table, all of them there to celebrate my father's latest victory in the legal world. I sat near the end of the table, feeling like an uninvited ghost at my own family's feast. My fingers were trembling beneath the table, clutching a thick cream envelope that felt heavier than lead. It was my acceptance letter from the prestigious Design Academy in Paris, a document that represented every late night I had spent sketching until my vision blurred and every penny I had scraped together for portfolio materials. The tuition was $58,000 a year. To my father, that was the price of a mid-tier watch or a few cases of vintage Bordeaux. To me, it was the key to a prison cell I had lived in my entire life. 3 seats away, my brother Julian was holding court. He had just turned 21, and earlier that afternoon, my father had handed him the keys to a brand new silver Porsche 911. Julian hadn't even finished his undergraduate degree in law, mostly because he spent more time at the racetrack than in the library. But in my father's eyes, Julian was the son. Everything he did was a stroke of genius. Every failure was just a stepping stone for a Vance man. Julian's college tuition for all 4 years had been settled in full before he even walked across the stage at his high school graduation. He never had to ask. He never had to prove his worth. He simply existed, and for that, he was rewarded with the world. I waited until the main course had been cleared and the waiters were pouring a $400 a bottle dessert wine. The mood was boisterous, filled with the loud, performative laughter of the wealthy. I leaned toward my father, my voice barely a whisper. "Dad," I asked, "could we possibly speak for just a moment? Privately?" My father, Alistair Vance, didn't even turn his head. He was busy adjusting his gold Rolex, the light reflecting off the polished metal and stinging my eyes. He smiled at the man sitting across from him, a high-ranking judge, and then spoke loud enough for the entire half of the table to hear. "Whatever you have to say, Elena, say it here. We are among family and friends. There are no secrets at this table." My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked at the judge, at my aunts in their designer silks, and finally at my mother. She was perfectly composed, her Hermes scarf tied with mathematical precision, but her eyes were fixed firmly on her gold-rimmed dessert plate. She wouldn't look at me. She knew what was coming. I pulled the letter from beneath the table and placed it on the cloth. "I've been accepted to the Academy in Paris," I said, my voice shaking, despite my best efforts to be brave. "It's one of the top 3 programs in the world. I've worked so hard for this, Dad. I was hoping, just hoping, that you might consider supporting my tuition the way you've supported Julian." The silence that followed was so sudden it felt like the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. My father didn't pick up the letter. He didn't even glance at the prestigious seal on the envelope. He simply set his wineglass down with a slow, deliberate click that echoed like a gunshot. "Help you?" he repeated. His voice was smooth, practiced, and utterly devoid of warmth. "The way I helped Julian?" He stood up then, a move designed to dominate the space. Suddenly, I was very small, and every pair of eyes in that room was a judgmental lens focused on my face. My aunt stopped whispering. The judge leaned back, looking uncomfortable but curious. "Julian is a Vance," my father announced, his voice booming across the restaurant. "He is my son. He is the one who will carry this name into the courtrooms. He is the one who will build upon the legacy I have spent 30 years creating. He is an investment in the future of this family." He turned his gaze toward me, and for a second, I saw a flash of pure, cold disdain. "And you, Elena? You are a girl. You are a guest in this house until you become a guest in someone else's. You will eventually marry a man from a good family, you will take his name, and you will raise his children. Why would I waste $58,000 a year on a degree you will hang in a nursery and never use? Why would I fund a hobby that will end the moment you walk down a church aisle?" I felt my face burning, a hot, prickly sensation that moved from my neck to my forehead. "Dad, please," I whispered, my eyes stinging. "Can we talk about this later?" "Not here." "There is nothing to talk about," he snapped, his volume increasing as if he wanted to make sure the kitchen staff could hear him. Julian never had to beg because Julian knows his place. He knows what he owes this family. You, on the other hand, think you are entitled to the same rewards without having the same purpose. You want to play with fabric and sketches while your brother prepares to lead. If you want to be an artist, go earn the money yourself. See how far your talent gets you without my name and my bank account behind you. I looked at Julian. He was staring at his phone, a small, smug smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He didn't say a word to defend me. He didn't even look up. I looked at my mother again, praying for even a flicker of support. She just reached out and began rearranging the silk napkin in her lap, her movements frantic and small. She was terrified of him, and in that moment, I realized she would let him drown me if it meant she stayed dry. My father leaned down, his face inches from mine. I could smell the expensive cologne and the faint scent of old money. "I'll email you my full reasoning tonight," he whispered, his voice like a jagged blade, "just so you truly understand your place in the Vance hierarchy. Now, sit down and finish your dessert." "You're embarrassing your mother." I didn't sit down. I didn't finish my dessert. I picked up my acceptance letter, the one he hadn't even deigned to touch, and I walked out of that restaurant. I walked past the valets and the luxury cars, past the life of ease that was being held over my head like a weapon. I didn't know then that the email he promised would be the final blow, a digital scar that would stay with me for a decade. I only knew that the girl who walked into L'Etoile was dead, and the woman who was about to survive the storm was just beginning to breathe. The walk from the golden lights of Mayfair to the gritty streets of East London felt like traveling between two different planets. I had walked out of that restaurant with my head held high, but by the time I reached the subway, the adrenaline had faded, replaced by a hollow, gnawing ache in my chest. I spent the next 72 hours in a state of suspended animation, moving through a tiny, damp apartment that cost me $550 a month, money I had painstakingly saved from a secret part-time job at a local library. The contrast was a physical weight. Back in Kensington, the floors were heated marble. Here, the linoleum was peeling at the corners, revealing cold concrete beneath. In my father's house, the air always smelled of fresh lilies and expensive beeswax. Here, it smelled of stale cigarette smoke from the neighbor and the metallic tang of an old radiator that clanked and groaned but never actually produced heat. I sat on a thin, second-hand mattress, my coat still on, watching my breath mist in the freezing air. I was waiting. Despite everything he had said at the dinner table, a small, pathetic part of me was still waiting for a phone call, a text, or even a sign that his anger had cooled. On the third night, the notification finally came. The blue light of my aging laptop flickered, illuminating the dark room with a clinical, harsh glow. An email from Alistair Vance. My heart did a slow, painful roll in my chest. My fingers were so cold they felt like sticks as I reached for the trackpad. I thought perhaps it was an olive branch. Maybe he had realized that humiliating his daughter in front of a judge and his colleagues was a step too far even for him. I clicked. I read, and then I felt the world tilt. The email was far worse than anything he had shouted in the restaurant. At the table, he had been performative, playing to an audience. In the digital silence of an email, he was surgical. He was a lawyer by trade, and he used his words like a scalpel to dissect my very existence. Elena, the email began, your behavior at L'Etoile was not just a disappointment. It was a confirmation of everything I have feared about your character. You seem to believe that you have a right to the resources I have spent a lifetime building. Let me be perfectly clear. You do not. Being born female is a biological reality, one that carries specific social and familial expectations that you seem intent on ignoring. Julian is my heir. He is the future of the Vance legacy. He is the one who will maintain the name and the estate. You, however, are merely a temporary member of this family until you take another man's name. To invest $58,000 a year in a hobby like fashion design is not only a poor business decision, it is an insult to the work I do. You have chosen to walk away from the protection of this house. Do not contact me again, do not ask for a single cent, and do not expect to be welcomed back until you are ready to offer a public apology for the humiliation you caused me. Until then, you are on your own. Do not forget that without the Vance name, you are nothing. I read those words over and over until they blurred into a jagged smear of black ink. The nothing at the end of the sentence felt like a physical blow to my stomach. I looked around my room, the single light bulb hanging from a frayed cord, the cold bowl of instant ramen on the desk, the broken zipper on my only suitcase. For a moment, I believed him. I felt the heavy, suffocating weight of his words pressing down on me, telling me that my value was zero, that my dreams were a hobby, and that my gender was a debt I could never pay off. I felt my eyes sting, and a single hot tear tracked down my cheek. My hand moved toward the trackpad, my finger hovering over the delete button. I wanted it gone. I wanted to erase the evidence that my father looked at me and saw nothing but a liability. I wanted to forget that he could be this cold, this calculated. But as my finger trembled over the trash icon, something shifted deep inside me. It wasn't a spark of hope. It was a cold, hard ember of rage. I remembered what he had done in the restaurant, how he had looked at Julian with pride and at me with disgust. I realized that if I deleted this email, I would be helping him hide the truth. I would be participating in the lie that he was a good father and I was just a difficult daughter. I moved the cursor away from the delete button. Instead, I right-clicked on my desktop and selected New Folder. My keyboard clicked loudly in the silent, freezing room. I typed out the name in all capital letters, Evidence. I dragged the email into that folder. I didn't know then that I would eventually fill it with hundreds of other files. Screenshots of text messages from relatives who suddenly stopped calling, records of his attempts to block my internship applications, and notes on the lies he was beginning to tell the world about my mental health. At that moment, I just knew I needed proof. I needed a reminder for the days when I felt weak, for the nights when I contemplated going back and begging for his forgiveness. I needed to be able to look at his own words and remember exactly who Alistair Vance was. He wanted me to believe I was nothing without him. He wanted me to be erased. But as I stared at that folder on my screen, I knew that the digital scar he had just given me wouldn't be my downfall. It would be my fuel. I closed the laptop, the darkness of the room returning, but the image of that folder remained burned into my mind. He thought he had ended the conversation. He had no idea that he had just given me the opening line for a story I would tell 12 years later on a stage he could never reach. He had given me the evidence, and one day, the whole world would see it. For 2 months after that night, I lived in a state of hypervigilance. I was a 22-year-old girl in a city that felt increasingly cold, working 2 jobs just to keep the lights on in a room that smelled of damp walls and old wood. I was surviving on caffeine and the raw, jagged edge of my own determination. I had started my final semester, hiding my exhaustion behind layers of cheap concealer and oversized sweaters. I thought the hardest part was behind me. I thought that by leaving, I had escaped the reach of Alistair Vance. But I was so incredibly naive. I didn't realize that my father wasn't just content with kicking me out. He was actively working to make sure I had nowhere to turn if I ever tried to come back. The first hint of the campaign came on a Tuesday evening. I was sitting at my small, scarred wooden desk, trying to focus on a blueprint for my final project. The radiator was making a sound like a dying engine when my phone vibrated. It was my Aunt Beatrice, my mother's younger sister. She had always been the one who sent me extra birthday cards and whispered that I was the smartest girl in the room. I picked up, expecting a warm voice. Instead, I heard a heavy, suffocating silence on the other end. "Elena, sweetheart," she said, her voice dripping with a kind of fragile, forced concern. "How are you feeling today? Are you taking your medication? Are you getting the help you need?" I frowned, my pen hovering over the paper. "Medication?" "Aunt Beatrice, what are you talking about? I'm fine. I'm just working a lot. Why are you asking me this?" There was a sharp intake of breath. "Oh, Elena, you don't have to pretend with me. Your father told us everything. He told us about the breakdown at the restaurant. He said you've been struggling with this condition since you were a teenager, and that's why you had to leave home so suddenly. He said the family tried everything to get you into a proper facility, but you refused treatment and ran away. He's so worried about you, darling. We all are. We've been praying for your recovery." The room didn't just tilt. It felt like the floor had been snatched from beneath my feet. I gripped the edge of my desk so hard my knuckles turned white. "Aunt Beatrice," I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of terror and fury, "I don't have a condition. I didn't have a breakdown. He kicked me out because I asked for my tuition. He lied to you." "Oh, honey," she replied, her voice soothing in that terrifying way people talk to a frightened animal. "It's okay. Paranoia is often part of the struggle. You don't have to be ashamed. Mental illness is nothing to be embarrassed about, but you have to be honest with yourself if you want to get better." I hung up. My heart was racing so fast I could hear it in my ears. I called 3 more relatives that night, a cousin, an uncle, a family friend. Every single one of them gave me the same response. They spoke to me with a heartbreaking, gentle pity. They spoke as if I were made of glass that was already shattered. If you have ever been the villain in someone else's story simply because you chose to speak a truth they couldn't handle, you know how lonely that silence feels. You know the frustration of shouting into a void where everyone has already been told you are crazy. If you are rooting for the truth to come out, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps me know I am not telling this story to an empty room. And for those of you listening, have you ever had someone spread a lie about you just to protect their own reputation? How did you handle that betrayal? I'd genuinely like to read your experiences in the comments below. That same night, my cousin Julian sent me a screenshot. It was from the Vance family group chat, the one I had been removed from the morning after the restaurant incident. There were over 40 people in that chat. My father had sent a long, carefully worded message. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. "Please do not contact Elena directly," it read. "She is currently going through a severe mental health crisis. Our doctors have advised that any outside stimulation or confrontation could make her condition significantly worse. We have tried every intervention possible, but she has chosen to isolate herself. Please just keep her in your thoughts. We are doing our best to manage this tragedy privately." I stared at the screen for a long time. I realized then that my father wasn't just punishing me, he was erasing me. By labeling me as mentally unstable, he had invalidated every word I would ever say against him. If I told people the truth about his cruelty, it would just be seen as a symptom of my delusion. He had built a fortress of lies around my reputation, and he had used the genuine love of my relatives as the bricks. I spent 3 days in that cold room, barely eating, just pacing the floor and running through scenarios. I wanted to call a lawyer. I wanted to print out his emails and mail them to every person in that group chat. I wanted to scream from the rooftops of Kensington that Alistair Vance was a liar. But then I stopped. I looked at myself in the cracked mirror above the sink. I was 22. I had no money, no degree yet, and no standing in the community. My father was a senior partner at a top law firm, a man who sat on charity boards and played golf with judges. Who would the world believe? The powerful, grieving father who was doing his best, or the unstable daughter who had nothing to her name? I realized I couldn't win that fight with words. Not yet. I opened my laptop and went back to the folder I had created. Evidence. I took screenshots of every text message from my relatives. I saved the message from the group chat. I added them to the email he had sent. He wanted me to be a ghost, a tragic story whispered about at dinner parties. But I decided right then that I wouldn't be his tragedy. I would be his reckoning. I closed the laptop, picked up my charcoal pencils, and went back to work. I had a portfolio to finish, and if my father wanted to tell the world I was a ghost, then I was going to make sure I haunted his legacy with my success. The truth didn't need me to scream it. It just needed me to build a stage big enough for it to eventually stand on. The years that followed were a blur of caffeine, blue light, and the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that makes your vision vibrate. I didn't have the luxury of wallowing in my father's betrayal. While he was busy polishing his reputation at the country club and telling the London elite that his daughter was a tragic mental case, I was working 2 part-time jobs and carrying a full course load at the Design Academy. My day started at 5 a.m. at a frantic coffee shop near Liverpool Street Station, where the air was thick with the smell of burnt milk and the impatient energy of commuters. I worked there until 10 a.m., then raced to my classes, my fingers often stained with ink and espresso. From 6 p.m. to 10 p.m., I worked the front desk of a small architectural firm, filing blueprints and answering phones for designers who didn't even know my name. On a good night, I slept 4 hours. On a bad night, I didn't sleep at all. My father had been right about one thing. The Vance name was powerful, but he was wrong about everything else. I didn't need his money to have a brain, and I certainly didn't need his permission to have a soul. I took out federal loans that made my stomach churn every time I saw the balance, and I applied for every obscure scholarship I could find. It turns out there is no fuel more potent than pure, unadulterated rage. It kept me awake when my body wanted to collapse, and it kept my grades at the top of the class. I wasn't just studying, I was building a fortress. It was during my second year that the trajectory of my life shifted forever. The academy announced a guest lecturer for the semester, a name that made every student in the building hold their breath. Vivienne Vance. She was 70 years old, a legendary figure who had designed museums in 3 different countries and graced the cover of every significant design magazine in existence. She was one of the first women to ever break into the upper echelons of the industry, a woman who had spent 5 decades proving that a woman's place was at the drawing board, not just in the kitchen. I remember the day she walked into the lecture hall. She didn't just enter a room, she commanded the air within it. Her hair was a sharp silver bob, and her gray eyes were like flint. After one of her lectures on sustainable urban structures, I was frantically packing my sketches into my bag, trying to make it to my evening shift on time. "You are the one who did the Morrison Project, aren't you?" a voice asked. It was calm, precise, and carried the weight of absolute authority. I looked up, my heart stopping. Vivian was standing 3 feet away, studying me. I nodded, unable to find my voice for a second. Yes, the adaptive reuse concept for the old East End warehouse. "It was exceptional," she said, her eyes narrowing as if she were reading the blueprints of my mind. It had a level of restraint that most students your age lack. "Tell me about your background. Where did you learn to see space like that?" I hesitated. I had spent 2 years perfecting the art of deflecting this question. I didn't want sympathy. And I certainly didn't want anyone to know about the mentally unstable girl my father had created. "My family doesn't support my career," I finally said, keeping my voice as flat as possible. "We are no longer in contact." Most people would have pressed. They would have offered a pitying look or asked what had happened. Vivian just nodded slowly, as if I had simply told her the weather. "My father told me women shouldn't be architects," she said. "He didn't speak to me for 15 years after I enrolled in my first design course. He told the neighbors I had gone to live with a distant aunt because I was too difficult to manage." She reached into her structured leather bag and handed me a heavy, cream-colored business card. "I have a private studio in the city. I need an intern for the summer. There is no pay, but I will teach you everything the academy cannot. Come by on Monday if you want to learn the long game." I took the card, the edges crisp against my palm. "Miss Vance," I whispered, "you have no idea what this means to me." She gave me a small, knowing smile. "Actually, Elena, I think I do." That summer was a masterclass in survival. Vivian didn't just teach me about textiles, lighting, and structural integrity. She taught me about strategy. She taught me how to walk into a room full of men who wanted me to fail and make them believe that my vision was the only one that mattered. We spent countless hours in her studio, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the London skyline. One evening, as we were reviewing a set of floor plans, I confessed to her that sometimes the weight of the lies my father was telling felt like they were drowning me. I told her that I wanted to scream the truth at every person who looked at me with pity. Vivian set her glasses down and looked at me with those sharp, gray eyes. "Success is the best response to people who doubt you, Alina," she said firmly. "Not because it proves them wrong, though it eventually will, but because it proves you right to yourself. If you spend your life trying to get a retraction from a man who refuses to see you, you are still letting him lead the dance. Stop trying to win an argument with a liar. Start winning the life you were meant to have." I carried those words with me like a shield. Over the next 10 years, I watched the Vance name continue to flourish in the legal world, while I quietly built a name that meant something entirely different. In years 1 and 2, I graduated with the highest honors in my class. My father didn't attend the ceremony, and I didn't expect him to. In years 3 through 5, I worked as a junior designer, making barely enough to cover my student loans, but I stayed later than anyone else. I took the projects no one wanted, the difficult renovations, the low-budget community centers, and I turned them into art. My first solo award was for a tiny boutique cafe in Soho, and I remember holding that small trophy and realizing that for the first time, I didn't care if Alistair Vance knew about it or not. By year 8, Vivian had recommended me to a prestigious firm in Chicago. I moved across the ocean with 2 suitcases and a digital folder full of evidence that I had never opened. Within 18 months, I was a senior designer. Within 3 years, I was leading my own team. My name started appearing in national magazines. I was invited to speak at conferences. I had built a reputation based entirely on the quality of my work, a foundation that no rumor could shake. Through all of it, my father never stopped. I heard from distant acquaintances that he had refined his story. Now he told people that my success was a fluke, a temporary high before my inevitable collapse. He said the family was still monitoring my situation from afar. He was still trying to own my narrative, even from thousands of miles away. But the cracks were beginning to show. People were starting to see the woman on the stage and the man in the country club, and the two stories no longer matched. Vivienne had been right. The truth didn't need me to scream. It just needed me to keep winning. And I was just getting started. The small, black USB drive sat on my mahogany desk in Chicago like a dormant grenade. It was a Sunday night, the kind of night where the city feels quiet and the wind off Lake Michigan rattles the windows of my office with a haunting, rhythmic persistence. I had been back from London for 3 days, having attended my brother Julian's wedding at the Waverly Country Club. It had been an exercise in professional invisibility. I had worn a navy dress, stood in the shadows, and watched my father, Alistair, play the role of the proud patriarch while he looked right through me as if I were a ghost. But it was what happened in the rose garden that had changed everything. My mother, usually a silent spectator to my father's cruelty, had pulled me aside into the darkness of the terrace. Her hands had been trembling so violently that her gold bracelets clattered together. She didn't say much. She just pressed this piece of plastic into my palm and whispered, "I have known his passwords for years. He thinks I am too quiet to notice, but I have seen what he has done to your name. I couldn't stop him, Elena. I was too afraid. But you can use this." Now, sitting in the safety of my Chicago apartment, I finally found the courage to plug it in. The laptop made a soft chime as it recognized the drive. My heart was thumping against my ribs, a dull, heavy ache. I clicked on the folder. There were over 50 files, meticulously organized by date. Emails, screenshots of text messages, chat logs from the Vance family group, the one I had been purged from a decade ago. I began to read, and with every sentence, the world seemed to grow colder. For 10 years, I had known my father was lying about my mental health to our relatives. I had felt the pity in their eyes and heard the forced gentleness in their voices. But I had never seen the raw, unedited transcripts of his malice. Elena is having another episode. One email read, sent to my favorite aunt. Please do not try to contact her. Any stimulation makes the delusions worse. We have consulted 3 specialists, and they all say the same thing. She refuses treatment. It breaks my heart to say this, but my daughter cannot function in normal society. I felt a wave of nausea roll through me. He had used the language of medicine and the tone of a grieving parent to turn my own flesh and blood against me. He had gaslit an entire family into believing I was a danger to myself so that no one would ever question why he had thrown me out in a blizzard for wanting an education. But then I scrolled down to a folder labeled professional. And that was where the knife didn't just twist. It shattered. I found an email sent 5 years ago. It was addressed to Robert Chen, one of the most powerful real estate developers in the Midwest. I remember that time vividly. I was 29, still a junior designer, and Robert had reached out to me about a massive project, a renovation of the Meridian Hotel collection. It was supposed to be my first big break, the kind of project that defines a career. I had spent weeks on the pitch, I had poured my soul into the sketches, and then at the very last second, the deal had vanished. Robert had told me there were budget concerns, and they were going in a different direction. I had spent months blaming myself, wondering what I had done wrong, questioning if I truly was as talented as Vivienne told me I was. I opened the email my father had sent to Robert Chen. "Robert," my father had written, "I know you are considering hiring my daughter for the Meridian project. I am telling you this as a friend. Don't. She is not stable. She has serious mental health issues that she refuses to address, and her history of erratic behavior is a liability you cannot afford. If you bring her onto this project, you will regret it. I am saying this because I care about your firm's reputation, and I don't want to see you damaged by her inevitable collapse." I stared at the screen until the words blurred into a jagged smear of light. He hadn't just been lying to my aunts and uncles at dinner parties. He had been actively, systematically sabotaging my livelihood. He had reached across an ocean to try and burn the bridge I was building for myself. He didn't just want me gone from his house. He wanted me erased from the industry. He wanted to ensure that no matter how hard I worked or how many nights I went without sleep, I would always hit a glass ceiling made of his lies. I leaned back in my chair, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. I looked at the Crystal Award on my shelf, a minor trophy I had won a few years ago. I realized then that every success I had achieved had happened in spite of a ghost hunter stalking my footsteps. I hadn't just been fighting the industry. I had been fighting a silent war against my own father's shadow. The betrayal felt like a physical weight, a cold leaden mass in the pit of my stomach. He had told the world I couldn't hold down a job while he was the one making sure I couldn't. He had played the suffering martyr while he held the smoking gun. I closed my laptop and walked over to the window. The Chicago skyline was a glittering tapestry of steel and light, a stark contrast to the dark, suffocating secrets on that USB drive. I thought about Vivian's voice. I thought about her telling me that the truth doesn't need to scream. For 10 years, I had carried the shame he had projected onto me. I had wondered if there was something inherently wrong with me, something that made me unworthy of a father's love. But looking at those emails, the shame evaporated. It was replaced by a clarity so sharp it felt like a diamond. He wasn't afraid I was crazy. He was afraid I was brilliant. He was afraid that a girl from the Vance family might actually build something bigger and more enduring than his legal firm. He had tried to bury me because he knew I was the only one who could truly outshine the legacy he had bought for Julian. I reached for my glass of wine and finally took a sip. It was cold and crisp. My hand was no longer shaking. I looked at the USB drive. I didn't want to scream anymore. I didn't want to call him and demand an apology that would only be more lies. I opened the evidence folder on my desktop and dragged every single file from the USB into it. I organized them. I backed them up. I had the receipts now. I had 10 years of systematic destruction documented in his own words, sent from his own professional accounts. My father thought he was the master of the long game. He thought that by destroying my reputation he had won. But he had forgotten one thing. You can only lie about someone as long as they stay in the shadows. And as I looked out at the city, I knew that my stage was coming. The Golden Needle Awards were only a few months away. I was on the short list, and for the first time, I knew exactly what I was going to do with that microphone. He had given me the scar, but my mother had given me the scalpel. And when the time was right, I was going to perform a surgery the whole world would witness. The notification arrived on a Tuesday afternoon while I was in my Chicago office, reviewing the final lighting schematics for a boutique hotel in Miami. My inbox pinged with a soft, unassuming chime, but the subject line made me freeze in my chair. Official nomination, International Award for Design Excellence. I read the email 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. The Interior Design Association was recognizing my work on the Meridian Hotel collection, the very project my father had tried to sabotage 5 years prior. The ceremony was scheduled for March 15th at the Grand Hyatt in New York, and the final sentence sent a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. The event will be broadcast live via television and international streaming platforms. I leaned back, my heart hammering against my ribs. For 10 years, I had worked in the shadows, building a fortress of professional accomplishments, while my father, Alistair Vance, built a fortress of lies. Now, those two worlds were about to collide on a global stage. I picked up my phone and called Vivian immediately. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the sharp edge of pride when she spoke. "I know, Elena," she said. "I am on the selection committee. I saw your work, and I saw the unanimous vote. I have already arranged to be the one introducing your category on stage. Your stage is finally here." As the weeks leading up to the ceremony passed, a strange cold clarity settled over me. I wasn't the frightened 22-year-old girl in the rain anymore. I was a senior designer with a team that trusted my vision and a mentor who had seen my worth. But the true turning point, the moment the game changed, happened exactly 1 week before the event. I was in my apartment, standing in front of a full-length mirror and trying on my dress for the gala. It was emerald green, custom made by a friend, with a neckline that made me feel like I was wearing armor rather than silk. My phone buzzed on the vanity. It was a text from Julian. We hadn't spoken in months, not since the wedding where he had looked at the floor while our father lied about my medication. Iris, he wrote, using the name Alistair, had never managed to erase from his own memory. I need to tell you something. Dad is hosting a watch party for the awards ceremony at the Kensington house. He invited all his senior partners, his golf buddies, and Tom Patterson, his biggest client. He doesn't know you're nominated. None of them do. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the glass. Why is he watching a design award? I typed back. One of his biggest legal clients is the primary sponsor for the event, Julian replied. He thinks it will be good networking to discuss the winners with the sponsors live. He's going to be sitting in the library with the big screen on, surrounded by every single person he's spent 12 years lying to about you. I sat down slowly on the edge of my bed, the emerald silk swishing against my legs. I could picture it perfectly. I could see the leather armchairs, the smell of expensive scotch, the group of powerful men in their tailored suits, nodding as Alistair Vance told them yet another tragic story about his poor, unstable daughter who couldn't keep a job. And then, in the middle of their networking, my face would appear on that screen. I looked at the black USB drive sitting on my nightstand, the evidence my mother had given me. I had 2 speeches prepared in my mind. The first was the standard industry speech, grateful, humble, and professional. It was the speech of a woman who wanted to move on. The second speech was different. It was the speech of a woman who was done being a ghost. I spent that night in my office, the city lights of Chicago flickering like distant stars outside my window. I opened the evidence folder on my laptop. I read through the email Alistair had sent me 12 years ago, the one that told me I was nothing. I read the sabotage email he sent to Robert Chen. I read the texts from aunts and uncles who had been convinced I was delusional. Every word was a jagged piece of a narrative I hadn't written. For a decade, I had allowed him to own the truth because I thought my work would eventually speak for itself. But as Vivian had told me, sometimes the truth needs a stage big enough for everyone to hear. I began to write. I didn't use a pen. I typed with a rhythmic, surgical precision. I wasn't writing a revenge fantasy. I was writing a factual account. I was aligning the man they saw in the library with the man who had sent those emails. I wanted the people in that room to see the smoking gun while the gun was still in his hand. Julian sent one final message that night. Whatever you're going to do, I think it's time. The night before I flew to New York, I stood on my balcony, looking out at the dark expanse of Lake Michigan. I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known since I was a child. I realized that for 12 years, I had been waiting for an apology that would never come. I had been waiting for Alistair to realize he was wrong. But standing there, I understood that my healing wasn't dependent on his realization. It was dependent on my own. I packed my emerald dress, my red-soled heels, and the folded piece of paper containing the second speech. My father thought he was the master of the long game, but he had forgotten that I was the one who had survived the blizzard. He had given me the $62 and the broken suitcase, thinking they would be the end of my story. He had no idea they were just the prologue. I was no longer afraid of the spotlight. I was the one who had designed the space, and tonight, the world was going to see exactly what I had built from the ruins he left behind. The stage was set, the cameras were ready, and somewhere in London, my father was pouring a glass of scotch, completely unaware that his daughter was about to take back her name. The Grand Hyatt Ballroom in New York was even more spectacular than I had imagined in my most vivid fever dreams. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from 40-foot ceilings, casting a fractured, brilliant light over 500 of the most influential people in my industry. There were designers, architects, high-level executives, and journalists, all seated at tables draped in pristine white linen. But beyond this room, I knew there were hundreds of thousands more watching via television and live streams. Somewhere in a quiet, dark library in London, my father was sitting in his favorite leather armchair, surrounded by his business partners and his golf buddies, completely unaware that the daughter he had spent 12 years erasing was about to become the only thing they could see. I stood backstage, the emerald green silk of my dress catching the light every time I moved. Through a narrow gap in the heavy velvet curtain, I could see the sleek podium and the massive screen displaying the award logo. My throat felt like it was filled with dry sand. Beside me stood Vivienne, looking resplendent in a silver gown that matched her sharp bob. She took my hand, her grip surprisingly strong for a woman of 70. "Remember what I told you years ago, Elena," she whispered. "The truth does not need you to scream it. It just needs you to be lived. Whatever you decide to say up there, I am proud of you. Not because of the crystal trophy, but because of the woman who is standing here on her own 2 feet." This is the moment I want to pause for just a second. If you have been following my journey from that rainy night in London to this high-stakes stage in New York, you have walked with me through 12 years of enforced silence. Thank you for staying by my side. Before I reveal exactly how I dismantled my father's lies in front of the world, I want to ask you something. If you were standing in my shoes, with the microphone in your hand, and the person who tried to destroy you watching from afar, what would you say? Would you stay professional, or would you take your truth back? Please leave a comment below and let me know. I truly read your responses, and it means the world to know I am not telling this story to an empty room. And if you believe that everyone deserves the chance to prove their worth, regardless of where they came from, please consider subscribing to the channel. It helps ensure that stories like this one continue to find a voice. The lights in the ballroom dimmed and a hush fell over the crowd. I heard the presenter, a world-renowned architect, approach the podium. "This year's nominees for design excellence represent the very best our industry has to offer," he announced. "Their work pushes boundaries and transforms spaces into experiences." He began to read the names. Mine was last. Elena Vance for the Meridian Hotel Collection. The room went silent for a heartbeat, and then the presenter opened the gold envelope. He smiled and said my name. The ballroom erupted into applause. The music swelled, and for a moment I couldn't move. I felt Vivienne's hand give me a gentle push. 1 foot in front of the other, I told myself. I climbed the stairs, the spotlight following me like a living thing, white and blinding. The presenter handed me the award, a sculpture of crystal and silver that was much heavier than I expected. I stepped to the podium and looked out at the 500 faces in the audience. But in my mind, I was looking directly through the camera lens, straight into my father's living room. I imagined him mid-sentence, perhaps bragging about a construction deal, when my face filled the screen. I imagined the glass of scotch freezing halfway to his lips as his friends turned to him and asked, "Alistair, is that your daughter? The one you said was too unstable to hold down a job?" I gripped the sides of the podium and leaned into the microphone. "Thank you to the association," I began, my voice steadier than I felt. "Thank you to my incredible team and to my mentor Vivienne, who believed in my vision when I had nothing." The applause rippled through the room, but I didn't step back. I paused, letting the silence grow until it felt heavy. "But there is something else I need to say," I continued. I reached into my clutch and pulled out the folded piece of paper I had carried across the Atlantic. The paper contained the email my father had sent me 12 years ago. For a decade, I stayed silent, I told the audience. Not because I was ashamed, but because I knew that words alone would never be enough to combat the narrative my father built about me. He told everyone who would listen that I was mentally ill, that I was a burden who refused treatment, all to explain why I disappeared after he threw me out for wanting an education. A murmur rippled through the ballroom. I saw confused glances and raised eyebrows in the front rows. I didn't stop. I unfolded the paper and read his words exactly as he wrote them. "Elena, you were born a girl. That is a reality. You do not have the right to demand what belongs to your brother. You are just something to be given away to another family. Don't contact me again unless you are ready to apologize for humiliating me." I looked up from the paper, my eyes fixed on the camera. "I didn't apologize," I said. "I worked. And I want to say this directly to the man who wrote those words. Dad, if you are watching, and I know you are, this is my answer. I am not unstable. I am not broken. I am not a burden. I am standing on this stage because I earned it. And the only thing that was ever wrong with me was that I was born into a family that believed a daughter wasn't worth the investment." I held up the crystal award, the light catching its facets. "This is not revenge," I concluded. "This is just the truth. And as I have learned, The truth doesn't need me to scream. It just needed me to live it. The first person to stand was Vivian. Then another designer followed, then another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was on its feet, a thunderous wave of applause crashing against the stage. I stood there, finally breathing, knowing that across the ocean, my father's phone was likely beginning to ring and ring. The silence was over. I had taken back my name, and for the first time in 12 years, the world saw me exactly as I was. The aftermath of that night felt less like a celebration and more like the controlled, surgical demolition of a very expensive, very hollow skyscraper. Within 48 hours, the video clip of my acceptance speech had reached 3 million views. My phone was a constant, vibrating reminder that the wall of silence I had lived behind for 12 years had not just been breached, it had been vaporized. Media outlets from New York to London were begging for interviews, wanting to turn my family drama into a morning show segment or a tabloid cover story. I turned them all down. I told my publicist that I didn't want to be a professional victim. I wanted to be a professional designer. The speech said everything I needed to say, and the truth didn't need a follow-up interview to validate its weight. While I sat in the quiet of my Chicago apartment, watching the sunset over Lake Michigan, the world I had left behind in London was experiencing a seismic shift. I didn't have to be there to know exactly how it was playing out. My brother Julian, who had finally started to see the cracks in our father's foundation, told me about the meeting at the Waverly Country Club 1 week later. It was the kind of meeting where reputations were either polished to a mirror shine or ground into the dust. 4 men were waiting when my father, Alistair Vance, walked into the private dining room. Richard Calloway, James Monroe, David Foster, and Tom Patterson. These were the men who had spent a decade nodding along to Alistair's tragic tales about his mentally unstable daughter. Richard Calloway, my father's closest friend for 20 years, didn't even offer a handshake. He just gestured for Alistair to sit down. The air in the room was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and a cold, clinical judgment that Alistair usually reserved for his own opponents. According to Julian, my father tried to control the room the moment he sat down. He tried to claim the speech was taken out of context, that I was twisting a difficult family history to humiliate him and damage the firm. But Richard simply held up his phone. He showed Alistair a screenshot of a text message Alistair had sent him 3 years ago. "Don't bother with Elena. She is unstable, can't keep a job, and the family has tried everything. Just pray for her." "You lied to us, Alistair," Richard said, his voice as cold as the ice in his whiskey glass. "You lied to us for 10 years. We watched her accept that award. We saw her poise, her brilliance, and her undeniable success. She is clearly the opposite of everything you told us. Why would you do that to your own daughter?" My father had no answer. For the first time in his life, the man who lived by the law and the manipulation of the word found himself silenced by the undeniable reality of my existence. The meeting ended without the usual pleasantries or networking. The message was clear. The men who had trusted him for decades now saw him as a man without honor. Trust, once shattered into a million pieces like the crystal in my award, doesn't just glue back together. The professional consequences were swift and devastating. 2 major construction contracts for Vance Law's primary clients quietly dissolved. Board memberships that my father had held for 15 years were suddenly restructured, his name notably absent from the new leadership lists. The country club, his second home, became a cold, silent place where old friends suddenly remembered prior engagements when they saw him coming. He was still the CEO of his firm, but he was being pushed to the margins of the very community he had tried to protect from the shame of me. 2 weeks later, my mother called. This time, there was no whispering, no checking for footsteps in the hallway, no fragility in her tone. "Elena," she said, her voice clear and resonant, "I watched your speech 17 times. I watched you stand up there and tell the truth that I was too afraid to tell for 35 years. And I am so, so proud of you." Then she told me the news that I never thought I would hear. My father had blamed her for the emails, of course. He had screamed at her for 3 hours, accusing her of helping me plan the betrayal. But for the first time in 36 years, she didn't apologize. She didn't hide. She had contacted a lawyer and was filing for legal separation. I am 59 years old, Elena, she told me, and I just realized I've never made a single decision for myself in my entire adult life. I'm not going to let the last chapter of my story be about being too afraid to leave. She was starting therapy, she had secured a part-time job at an art gallery, and for the first time since I was a little girl, I felt like I actually had a mother again. She was finally walking on her own 2 feet, and it was a more beautiful sight than any building I had ever designed. Finally, there was Julian. We had a video call a month after the ceremony. He looked older, his eyes shadowed by a guilt he couldn't hide from anymore. He didn't try to make excuses. I need to say something, he started, and I need you to let me finish. I knew what Dad was saying was wrong. I've known for years. I heard him lie about you at golf outings and dinner parties, and I never said a word. I waited, the silence between us heavy and cold. I was a coward, Julian whispered, his voice cracking. I was a coward, because saying something would have meant admitting that I benefited from your suffering. My car, my tuition, my easy path, it all came at the price of your reputation. I didn't want to face the fact that my life was built on your exclusion. He told me he was in therapy, too. He was realizing that Alistair hadn't just hurt me. He had groomed Julian to be a mirror of himself, a man whose worth was tied to perfection and conditional love. And then he told me about his newborn daughter, Grace. I'm going to make sure she never, ever feels the way Dad made you feel, he promised. That is a promise I am making to myself and to you. I didn't forgive him that night. Too much time had passed, and too many wounds were still raw. But I told him I appreciated the truth. It was a start. 1 year later, as I sat in my new office as a partner at the firm, I looked at the award on my shelf. I rarely looked at it anymore. The speech had served its purpose. I had realized that my healing was never dependent on an apology from my father. It couldn't be, because men like Alistair Vance rarely admit they are wrong. They go to their graves believing their own lies. But my peace wasn't in his hands anymore. It was in my work, in my mentorship of young designers from difficult backgrounds, and in the quiet morning light hitting the Chicago skyline. I wasn't just the woman who called out her father on live TV. I was a partner, a mentor, and finally, a woman who was enough, just as I was. The truth had spoken, and it didn't need me to scream anymore. The media requests sat in a designated folder on my computer, a digital mountain of inquiries from every major morning show and tabloid from London to New York. They wanted the award-winning designer exposes father's lies headline with the tears, the drama, and the sordid details of the Vance family collapse. But as I sat in my new office in Chicago, looking at the gold-etched name on my glass door, Elena Vance, partner, I realized that I didn't want to be a professional victim. I had spent 12 years being defined by my father's lies. I wasn't going to spend the next 12 being defined by his downfall. I told my publicist to decline them all. The truth had already spoken on that stage, and it didn't need a follow-up interview to validate its weight. 1 year has passed since that night at the Grand Hyatt, and the silence that followed has been the most productive of my life. My new office overlooks the shimmering expanse of Lake Michigan, a view of endless horizon that feels like a physical representation of my future. On my shelf, the Crystal Award catches the afternoon light, but I rarely look at it anymore. It served its purpose. Beside it sits a watercolor painting Vivian gave me when she retired, with a note on the back that I read every morning. For Elena, who walked the whole way on her own 2 feet. Instead of chasing fame, I channeled my energy into the Elena Vance Mentorship Program. Once a month, I host a session for young designers who come from difficult backgrounds, students who are working 3 jobs, taking out massive loans, and fighting families who tell them their dreams are just hobbies. I met a young girl last week who reminded me so much of my 22-year-old self. She had a tattered sketch pad and eyes full of a familiar, desperate hunger for something better. I didn't tell her my life story. I didn't talk about the blizzard or the $62. I just looked at her work and told her, you don't need to come from the right family to build the right career. You just have to be willing to outwork everyone who doubted you. Seeing the spark of hope in her eyes was a more profound victory than any trophy I have ever held. My personal life has also found a new, quiet rhythm. I visited my mother in her new apartment in London last month. It is a small, sun-drenched space filled with succulents and art she picked out herself. No crystal chandeliers, no heavy oak doors, and no Alistair. She's working at a gallery now, learning about art history for the first time in her life. We sat on her balcony, drinking tea and talking about the future instead of the past. She told me she's in therapy, learning that it's never too late to start a new chapter. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I had a mother again, not just a silent observer of my pain. As for my father, I haven't spoken to him since the day I blocked his number. Through Julian, I hear that he is a diminished man. He still tells anyone who will listen that I manipulated the narrative and that he was a good father, but his circle has shrunk to a handful of people who don't know the full story. The country club invitations have stopped, and his business partners now route all their major decisions through my brother. I don't feel vindicated by this. I don't feel happy. I just feel at peace. I've realized that my healing was never dependent on an apology that was never going to come. Some people go to their graves believing their own lies, and Alistair Vance is one of them. My peace isn't in his hands anymore. It's in mine. I look at a photograph on my desk of me and Julian. He is trying his best to break the cycle of conditional love with his own daughter, Grace. We don't have the relationship we might have had if things were different, but we have a start. We have a conversation that isn't based on a lie, and that is enough for now. If you have stayed with me through this long journey, from the rain in London to the lights of Chicago, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. Your support has been a reminder that the truth really does matter. Before I sign off, if this story of resilience and self-worth resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I would love to read your final thoughts in the comments. How has your own journey of self-affirmation changed you? I am always listening, and I learn so much from your experiences. As I look out at the sunset over the lake, I think about that 22-year-old girl standing in the bus storm with a broken suitcase. I used to be ashamed of her. I used to think her rejection made her worthless. But now I understand that she was the strongest person I've ever known. She survived. She endured. She built a life from nothing. My father said I was nothing without his name, but he was wrong from the very beginning. I was always worthy. I was always enough. The only thing that changed was that I finally believed it. Your worth is not determined by the people who refuse to see it. Your success is not about proving them wrong. It's about proving yourself right. Keep fighting for your dreams, because you never know when your stage is coming. Thank you for being a part of my story. This chapter is finally closed, and I cannot wait to share the new projects and the new voices we're discovering in our next series. Stay tuned for our upcoming deep dive into the stories of the designers in my mentorship program. You won't want to miss how they are changing the world. I will see you in the next one.